Good evening. Well, it's great to see so many of you in the room and also online on obviously a topic that is very dear to all our hearts. And I'm delighted and honored to be the first lecturer of the 3rd century of BLSI's existence. So that's great. And it makes me wonder what they will say in the next 200 years. They'll probably say, what was democracy? On that note, let's get cracking. So, I mean, obviously lots of things have happened. When I organized this talk for the 21st of January, 2025, I wasn't thinking about the inauguration of our 47th President of the United States of America. He's not featuring in my presentation because I know that it will feature in the Q&A session. So I'm keeping the powder dry for you, ladies and gentlemen, to ask questions about Trumpism and Muskism and salutes and all sorts of things. And I keep that powder dry and we'll just talk about democracy, the state of democracy as it is at the moment, and also where it's likely to go and what we can do about it, I suppose, is the trajectory of the talk. There will be some slides in this, and if you can't see them, I'm going to talk you through them, because this is a really important talk to get facts out on the table. There's so many times in today's discussions, particularly on political issues and democracy, where actually people are just very emotive and there's no facts being presented. So my aim here today is to present the facts. If you can't see all the slides, I'll try to point out the salient bits while we're going through it. If not, have a look at it on the YouTube channel in a few weeks' time if you want to really get under the skin of the facts. So here we go. Okay, I thought I'm going to share some thoughts on democracy, early ones. And it always goes back to the ancient Greeks, as we all know. They came up with the concept of democracy, but didn't think very much of it. So here's Socrates, nearly the worst form of government, with the exception of tyranny, into which it descends. So that was the start of democracy. But don't forget, this was the Athenian city-state, where only males, property-owning Athenians, could actually be part of the assembly. So it was a very limited type of democracy. So the next one, Plato. He was slightly more positive, although ironic or even sarcastic. A charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, and dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. So that's how it started many, many years ago. And then democracy disappeared off the scene altogether. And it really only made a resurfacing during the age of Enlightenment and beyond. And then we get characters in the 19th century, and probably the most famous quote for democracy of them all, Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address: "The government of the people, by the people, for the people." And then equally well known a bit later on is Winston Churchill, and everybody probably knows this quote: "The worst form of government except all the other ones that have been tried before from time to time." So that's the background. Now, what is rather worrying is that only last week on Biden's sort of farewell speech, I'll quote him directly, and that is, "Today an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power and influence that really threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedom." So that was Biden's parting shot, only to be followed this week by the World Economic Forum, which states the extreme power and influence of the tech billionaires. So, I mean, you know, there are some dissenting voices which we need to go through. Okay, so definitions of democracy next is the first slide and the first sort of graphs. So I apologize if you can't see that, and it will be there. The bottom one is probably slightly earlier. We need to talk about, there's two definitions of democracy, autocracies, and somewhere in the middle. The top one is from the University of Gothenburg, the VDEM index, and the bottom one is from the democracy index done by The Economist. But if you think about it, don't read into it. So if you think on the right is most democracy, so full democracy or liberal democracy. On the left it goes further and further down to autocracies and dictatorships. And the difference is in terms of to what extent there are electoral processes in place and pluralist parties are in play. The functioning of government, is it diverse? Do various parties contribute? Is political participation by the populace evident, and is it clean, and is it fair? Is the political culture conducive to governing and also to change? And then finally, are the civil liberties being observed? So in both cases, those are the things. And if all five exist, you're on the right-hand side of this slide. If they don't exist and they're completely restricted, you're on the left-hand side of this slide. So the only thing you need to remember is the difference that they talk about is when one talks about flawed democracies and hybrid systems on the bottom, the top one talks about autocratic electoral governments. So I think when we come through this, I'll point this out. So the guidance by the Pew Center in terms of how to spot autocracies is low commitment to the democratic process, demonization of political opponents, encouragement of political violence, disrespect for fundamental minority rights, and so on. So, just as a starter for 10 before we get into the meat, how many of you think we live in a democracy? Hands up, please. Okay. And how many don't think we live in a democracy? Okay, so it's probably, it's 50-50 between we live in a democracy and no comment, and a few dissenters in the back, which is good. Okay, next question before we get going. Is the democratic process working? Hands up, please. Ooh, 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 ooh. Not good. Yeah, okay, that's a handful of people. So we'll see. So we'll see where we get to. Okay, so I didn't, democracy under attack, I didn't put a question mark because it is under attack. So this is, I'm not going to just give reasons why it may or may not be under attack. I'm actually going to go through 6 areas of attack. Populism being one, polarization of views and the unacceptance of other points of view as another, the lack of social cohesion, technology as well. So technology has the ability to be a good force for discussion and exploration, but also it can polarize, and we'll talk about that. And actually the biggest danger to democracy comes from democracy itself, especially when it then turns into tyranny and autocracies. So those are the kind of things that we'll be going through. Okay, the governance of the world. Here is the world. And if you see bluish, dark sort of tinted ones on the left-hand side, that's more the democracies you see there. The full democracies are the dark bluey ones, and then it gets worse as the redder you go into autocracies. Now, one of the things that's happened is that the US has just been downgraded to a flawed democracy, and this is quite interesting because it's supposed to be the archetypal democracy based on the liberal philosophy of Locke and Montesquieu and de Tocqueville. But it has problems, particularly in terms of the functioning of government and the political culture. I mean, in America, we know people can't actually talk to each other anymore. If you're a Democrat, you can't talk to a Republican. They have their own news channels, they have their own echo chambers. Finding any commonality is very interesting. And every American I've ever met in this country constantly apologizes for the Trump phenomenon. But when I go over there, I get the opposite. So passport holdings Americans don't like Trump, and by definition, possibly non-passport holding Americans do like him. Greece has made it back to a full democracy after the things they went through in terms of the financial crisis. Israel has now also been downgraded to a flawed democracy due to political culture and civil liberties, which is interesting. And India, in one of the measurements we just talked about, is now downgraded to a flawed democracy under Modi, and in the other definition is actually now an electoral autocracy. And we come on to that. So the world is, I wouldn't say it's a game of two halves, but it is quite noticeable that actually democracy is now playing a minority role in global politics. And then just a sort of summary of this, it just shows the democracy index of 2023 shows only 14% of countries have got full democracy, 30% are flawed democracies, and 20 are sort of hybrid schemes between autocracies and democracies, and 35 are actually authoritarian regimes. It's actually even more pronounced when you look at the world population. Only 7.8% of the world population live in a full democracy. Right? So this is food for thought. And then we need to understand, well, what actually is going on. And I want to not show you the snapshot of 2023, I also wanted to show you a trend. And here you see the trend of different types of things. So here, for example, can you see that one here? That is closed autocracies, so completely closed off from other nations. And they've plummeted, but they plummeted particularly when the liberal order was supposed to rise to the surface. You know, the end of the Cold War, the Soviet breakdown of the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain came down. Francis Fukuyama wrote his book, The End of History, proclaiming the liberal order had won the day, etc., etc., etc. And obviously the liberal order hadn't won the day because things changed. So what replaced closed autocracies were basically electoral autocracies that you can see rose from a low point are now probably actually as high as electoral democracies. So a big change. What has happened recently since the financial crisis here is that actually closed autocracies are on the rise in the last few years, and actually liberal democracies are on the decline. So things are changing over periods of time. Now this is the number. If I show you the next one in terms of population, so this is now not number of countries, but the population, you can see autocracy here, electoral, where there's some election, but not really participatory elections, like Russia, for example, and then closed autocracies, where you've got nothing, like North Korea, for example. They make up 71% of the world. So, you know, and they're not getting any better. So this trend here of liberal democracies is trending down. Electoral things, democracies are also trending down in terms of world population. Okay, the next one is, next topic. So we talked about autocracies, the danger autocracies face to democracy because of what people think around particular key events like the breakdown of the Soviet Union, democratization going up, financial crisis, things reversing. Pandemic, also things are becoming less favorable for democracies because democracies are seen to fail to protect citizens in things like the COVID-19 pandemic. Right, so this is now a slide here in terms of the dissatisfaction with democracy. And you can see it's increased quite significantly between 2005 and 2020 from 36 to 57.5%, and it's actually quite pronounced differently in different countries. So if you look at Spain, for example, and Southern Europe, the dissatisfaction with democracy is significantly higher than other parts of for example, Germany and Sweden are at the bottom in terms of their dissatisfaction with democracy. But you've got people like the US, again, you know, the founding fathers of democracy, actually being very high up in terms of their dissatisfaction. And again, I mentioned the financial crisis, I mentioned other things as well. And also, trust in government is at a low point. Only 30% of people, when they're asked through the Edelman Trust Barometer whether they trust their government, say they do. 30%. And the lowest countries in that regard are Slovakia, Bulgaria, and France. The French have lost faith in democracy and their government. And, you know, that's why Marine Le Pen is doing well. And we come on to another slide shortly, which is all about populism and the effect that has across Europe and beyond. Okay. At a global scale, the satisfaction with democracy is lowest in the Anglo-Saxon world, in Southern Europe, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, whereas the Nordic countries, Northeast Asia, and post-autocracies have got the highest faith in democracy. So mature democracies are beginning to question that form of government the most. Okay. Right, we come on to populism is on the rise. And I'm myself, as you probably most of you know, I'm originally from Germany, and I'm an extremely worried man at this moment. With what's going on in Germany with the election and the breakdown of the traffic light coalition in Germany and going to the polls on the 23rd of February, I think it worries me. It worries me greatly, and it worries me greatly because the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, the far right in Germany, is now the second largest party in Germany. They're currently polling between 21 and 22%. Which to some extent, if they come anywhere near this, obviously in a country where you've got proportional representation, they will take a big chunk of the Bundestag and also will not be able to be frozen out by the main parties. Even, they had 70, 80 seats previously in the Bundestag. And basically the other parties could sort of gang up on them and not work with them. This will become increasingly more difficult, right, if you're the second largest party. And the Christian Democrats, which are also sort of centrist right, are the biggest party. So things in Europe, whether it's in Hungary, whether it's in France, whether it's in Germany, and even in Netherlands, the Freedom Party, there are some real, in the UK, the Reform Party is the third biggest party in the land, higher in terms of vote share, higher than the Lib Dems. This is, and obviously it's a different electoral system, but it shows that things are not according to plan. And I think we are back where we were 2,000 years with the ancient Greeks, because they were worried about that democracy will turn into tyranny, because they were concerned about the tyranny of the masses and didn't believe in the wisdom of the crowds. The wisdom of the crowds would be quite a diverse setup of people in the assembly being able to argue different opinions to come to an overall conclusion. The ancient Greeks thought that actually democracy, direct democracy in particular, would end up to be a tyranny of polarized opinions. Okay, and then obviously, as you can see here from the chart, Italy is another one. We've obviously got the far right already in power in Italy. So, they've got about just shy of 60% of the populist vote in Italy. Poland is not far behind, and neither is Hungary, where they've got the populist parties have anywhere between 40 and 60% of the vote share. All right, next one. And I apologize again for this number of slides, but if you can't see them here now, have a look at them on the video, because I think they are tantamount to the state of democracy that we find ourselves. Okay, so this is another one. This is participation. This is an index across multiple facets, things like participation in voting, freedom of expression, freedom of association, the state of free media, etc. They've produced an index in terms of how possible it is for the inhabitants of each country to actually participate in governance. So you obviously find quite a few of the usual suspects. Russia, the maximum you can get is 2.5 in this index. The absolute minimum would be 2.5. So if it's 2.5, you have absolutely every opportunity to participate in the running of your country. Minus 2.5 is you have absolutely no involvement, no ability to even make a contribution. And here, if you look at the bottom, you've got North Korea at the bottom with -2, not far off the cliff. And then you've got Norway here at 1.77 at the top. And then you've got varieties. I mean, what is interesting is also the changes. So although the Germans feel they can contribute more, what they're potentially contributing on the 23rd of February is actually going further right than they've been in 3 or 4 generations. Argentina, slight increases. South Korea, again, slight increases despite what's been happening recently. So this is obviously before the nightmare of martial law being enforced and not being enforced, and then people trying to protect the person from being arrested. So, you know, this is an interesting area to follow. Then some of America, Africa, and Turkey, for example, under Erdogan is trending the other way. So again, even the United States, we talked about now being a flawed democracy, even there, they don't feel that actually people have got enough involvement, possibility to be really involved. I mean, to some extent, you know, you can't even be on the ticket in America unless you have the backing of hundreds of millions of dollars that you can amass for people to actually support your campaign. I think, you know, in excess of $1 billion was spent on the election in the US recently. Okay, Norway is 1.77. Where does the UK sit? The UK sits nicely in the middle at about 1.26 currently in terms of participation. And the US has experienced one of the most significant drops in recent times. Okay. Right, so this is another big slide, and it is basically asking people, thousands and thousands of them in different countries, in terms of how much does democracy need to change? And all the ones at the top are the worst. So you've got Italy, Spain, US, South Korea, and these are saying needs to change completely, needs to fundamentally change, needs to change a little bit, and then doesn't need to change. So basically, I mean, as you go down here, Italy, big problems in terms of their perception of democracy. Spain, the US, South Korea, Greece, France, Belgium, Japan, Taiwan, Germany, UK. I mean, when you've got even the UK, so if you add these two up, that's 84 people, 84% in the UK think that democracy needs to change at least somewhat. And there's lots of reasons. There's electoral reforms, proportional representation, politicians, quality of politicians, diverse conversations not taking place in houses of parliament, etc., etc. So there's lots of different reasons. But mostly, when you ask people, it's about the economy. If the economy is not working for us, that capitalism in the Western world is directly equated with a liberal democracy. If our generation is no longer safe to be worse off than our previous generation, that's what the younger generations think, right? Then obviously something is not working for us. So it is the economy, it's the social environment, and it's the political divide that drive these kind of opinions. And some of these are in very right-wing countries, some of them are in left-wing countries, some of them are in centrist countries. They're not one of one type. Okay. Right, now we come to technology. And technology is again an interesting thing. This is just focusing on social media. The amount of airtime that is given to social media is significant, to the extent that actually the vast majority under the 40-year-olds do no longer go to official media channels. Terrestrial TV, newspapers, public service TV like the BBC, etc. They're no longer perceived to be credible sources of information. And actually, all of the information that is being gathered is actually through social media. And you would have thought that's a great thing, and some countries think there's some positivity here. So I think, you know, if you go down the worst side is, again, if you can't see it, US surprisingly think is actually it's a really bad idea, social media. This is not something positive. And then as you go down the different countries, it becomes more positive. So when you've got countries like Poland and Singapore and Hungary who are thirsting for information in the kind of governance they're in, they actually quite like social media to get information that isn't just fed to them by the state. But other countries like the US, the Netherlands, the UK, are trending generally negative towards social media. And obviously reasons are being given. It's a polarization of opinions. People create their own news. In fact, people argue that actually a third to a half of the information on social media is no longer produced by human beings, but is actually an assortment, an aggregation by social media and AI. And therefore, they only believe it if it supports their own belief. And that's what creates echo chambers. And so rather than social media being a vehicle for broad discussion where every opinion counts and you can have a meaningful exchange, the opposite side is demonized, right? As being incorrect, spreading lies, etc., etc. And this isn't going to go away. I mean, I'm not going to mention the 47th president of the United States by name. Oops, let me just go forward. By name, but obviously, he's already come up with his own executive orders, which I'm sure we'll discuss, because they are a bit like sort of grenades in the pond already. So I think there will be further ramifications of that. Okay, the next one, we talked about polarization, and this is one of the biggest dangers to democracy, where rather than actually everybody having a shared opportunity to exchange views, come to reasoned decisions, everything is polarized. And the question here is, our country is more divided today than it has been in the past. That's the question. And those are the percentages that actually agree with this. So yes, it is more divided. Top of the tree is the Netherlands, followed by Brazil, Sweden, France, Nigeria, and the US, with Germany and UK not far behind. That's one thing, right? It's one thing to say, yes, I think the world is becoming more polarized and divided. Yeah, but what does that make us do? And this is this is the frightening thing. So if you look at this, so the answers are the lack of civility and mutual respect today is the worst I've ever seen. 65% of those asked agree. The social fabric that once held this country together has grown too weak to serve as a foundation for unity and common purpose. 62%. But that's okay, that's a statement about the general affairs of things. The other three down here at the bottom is, if a person strongly disagreed with me or with my point of view, I would help them if they were in need. 30%. Just because somebody holds the opposite opinion strongly means 70% will not help them if they have different points of view. The other one, I would be willing to have them as a co-worker. 30%. 70% wouldn't want to work with somebody who's got a different opinion. A strongly held different opinion. And the worst one, even worse, is be willing to live in the same neighborhood. 80%. 80%. I mean, these are figures that are worse than at our own crisis during Brexit. Where families had feuds and wouldn't talk to each other because Remainers and Leavers, and even that seems to have quietened down now, but it's still rankering behind the scenes, especially in good old Bath, being a good remaining city. So there is perception is reality in this case. There are some really worrying trends. So this is the polarization. That is the issue. Now, what can we do about this? Because I think it's important that we don't just take this at face value. And I think one of the things, this goes back a long way. Noam Chomsky, the political commentator, philosopher, and linguist, wrote a book in 2006 talking about the abuse of power and the assault on democracy. That was in 2006, so nearly 20 years ago. So this is nothing new. I think what has changed is the landscape, the technology, the division between us that actually is the issue. So I think that I want to sort of share with you, there are some things that can be done and need to be looked at in terms of democracy. But we shouldn't just style it in terms of looking at democracy, because that just takes us back to the previous polarized views of what democracy is and what it should be, and we get down to nitty-gritty, and really don't get down to the necessary nitty-gritty, like the electoral system. What does direct democracy would look like? What is a different type of representative democracy? If we just focus on democracy, I think we're not going to get the full benefit. So this slide is about taking a new look at governance and good governance. One element of that is representation. So that, you've got free political parties that can play a part locally and centrally. There are clean elections that are validated and verified. And there's due governance processes in place. That's one. Rights and obligations. So I think one of the things that we're experiencing in the West at the moment is actually a very binary focus on our rights. So we're going back to sort of quite some of the libertarian principles of my rights as an individual, being able to express myself. I think what people sometimes miss is the other side of the coin of rights come obligations. Because your rights are also your obligations to other people, because it's their rights. And I think that's the kind of thing that we seem to have lost sight of. And that means we need to be much more concentrating on the shared civil liberties rather than just civil liberties for certain parts of society. Participation is another one. I mean, especially in some of the Western countries, our idea of being part of a democratic country is that we vote every 3 years. And basically we're exercising our suffrage. What true democracy is participation. I mean, even in ancient Greece was had limited democracy in terms of male, Athenians, property owning, and that was it. They did choose people to actually take roles in their assembly. They actually drew lots. So they actually made sure that people participated. And we've got countries like that. In Australia, for example, it is obligatory to vote. It's mandatory. You get fined if you don't take part. But even then, that's just taking part once every few years. You've done your bit, you've voted. And I think, in a true democracy, people would be engaged, would be politically aware, would be politically informed, would be politically educated, and would want to participate in the discussion. Okay. Common and shared, I think we touched on that. Currently we're living in a polarized world, and actually we need to find a way of bringing people together with different and disparate opinions to actually come up to some shared conclusions. And I always despair at the Houses of Parliament, Houses of Commons in particular, because the whole thing, the whole setup is adversarial. You sit opposite each other, a mace in the middle, and you start shouting at each other. And actually, today's scenario is that actually it's one upmanship, it's ad hominem attacks of the other. There's not much discussion around real policies, and we're talking about ideologies here. And I think one of the things that is going to be quite interesting in the years to come is how do we move away from political parties and their ideologies to actually focus on the actual issues at hand, the topics that need to be resolved. And obviously, we had our referendum, which still 50% or so are smarting about, but other countries quite like them. Switzerland have at least a referendum a month on various issues, and it's direct democracy. And then again, going back to ancient Greece, you would say, well, but in order for that to work, people need to be politically engaged, need to be educated politically, need to have understanding of the political issues, etc., to actually form a meaningful contribution to this. So there's stuff to be done. Application is relatively forward. We need to have defined governance processes that are actually being adhered to, rather than sort of being circumvented by tech billionaires. It's interesting actually because according to some, we don't live in a democracy anymore. We live in a techno-feudalism. Yeah. So Yanis Varoufakis, the ex-minister, finance minister of Greece, is now saying basically what Biden warned us about the tech billionaire oligarchy and the World Economic Forum is warning us about, namely that actually even us as citizens are being harvested for our information, only to be told what to think, what to buy, what to do. Now, I'm not, I'm a positivist. I don't think we're quite there yet. There are dangers of this. I don't see myself as some sort of serf to the tech billionaires, but it is an issue, the level of control that is being exercised. Okay, and then finally, checks and controls. You need to have the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive separation of powers. And obviously, we come on to talk about our friend Trump. Executive orders are supposed to be checked, even for the President of the United States, by the judiciary and the Supreme Court. But obviously, it depends on the people who are in the Supreme Court. And that might be a question in the room. Who are these people and under what control are they in terms of Trump? Okay. In terms of what the Pew Center, which is a democratic think tank, thinks needs to happen, we need to have better politicians. If you ask all the countries what needs to change, you saw the slide earlier in terms of significantly change needs to happen in democracy. The Pew Center did the research and said, well, okay, what does that mean? Apart from the United States of America, all countries said, number one thing is better politicians. So politicians who actually know what they're doing, have experience in what they're doing, have done it before, have been recognized as doing a good job, as opposed to career politicians who become the minister of this and the minister of that every 6 to 12 months, without any necessary prior experience in the subject. That's number one. Number two, system reform. And that's the number one in America. Even the Americans realize that this democracy, which consists basically of two parties, is probably not very democratic. Because the views that both parties expound are diametrically opposed. So you're going to get a massive bifurcation of trust in any election. Doesn't matter whether the Democrats win or the Republicans. 50% of the world, 50% of the population is disenfranchised because their interests aren't being looked after. And the third, and I think from my point of view, the most important is us as people, in terms of the political education, the political communication, and the discussions that take place to make those topic discussions and decisions in terms of a shared future more shared and inclusive. So, just to finish off, I started with this and I talked about what I think some of the attacks are, the sources of attack. And I want to bring it down at the very, very end, just to make sure that we all feel in the room that we have a role to play in this. Because was it last year? Last year I organized a series of talks on what the world will be like in 2050. I don't know whether many of you came to that, but it was a series of 8 talks from experts in climate change, in politics, in governance, in economics, in ecology, and so on. And when we did the wash-up afterwards, out of the 8 talks, the vast majority of people in the audience, and this would be probably close to 800 or so over the 8 talks, everybody thought the future is written by governments and big business. Only less than single-digit numbers thought it was down also to the individual. us to shape the future. And I think what I want to leave you with is that actually the causes that an individual feels in terms of disenfranchisement with democracy, and therefore by changing that, we can actually change the way we think about effective governance. So these are here. Nihilism, is there any meaning in anything anyway? You know, do we matter? Does my opinion matter? Does my action matter? That's one. On the top there, on the right hand side, then you've got the value crisis. What values should we adhere to? What are the values to live by? We used to have theology, right, which gave us certainty, religion. In a more secular society, we defaulted to a measure of success that was more capitalistic in terms of success, in terms of income and wealth. We are now at the threshold where the younger generation in particular feel that actually they're worse off or will be worse off than the previous generation for the first time in terms of jobs, in terms of being able to buy a house, in terms of income, etc. Left behindism, so they effectively feel left behind. They're not being catered for by the governors of the country. Binary values are failing, rights and wrongs, people are complaining, you know, if my opinion isn't the same as somebody else, I'm in a different echo chamber, I therefore can't talk to people on the other side, the echo chambers. And this is actually a big issue in terms of social media. We are finding ourselves more and more into echo chambers where we just basically got, because once you're in that echo chamber, all you will get is content that will be played to you that reinforces your already held belief. And it means that you get more and more severely entrenched in those thoughts. And then finally, ultimately, there's a meaning vacuum. You know, what are the values that we should actually, what is the meaning in terms of that I make in terms of contribution to society? But I think the positivity, just, you know, I don't want to leave you on that negativity. If I sort of screw back, that is, in my opinion, is the structure that we all need to look at in terms of what effective governance looks like, even if, and we shouldn't look at it and start off with democracy. So, we looked at the sources and I've finished off with the causes of the attack. So, all that remains me to say is now looking forward to the questions and thank you. No, that's great. Paula and Tony have kindly agreed to do the walking on. There's a microphone in the back, and Paul is doing the online audience contribution. If I get rid of this, I wonder whether all the people online will actually miraculously appear. Oh. Okay. Yeah, we've got some here, that's fine. So we've got some people on there. Maybe, Ollie, you can come upstairs and just do the screen sharing again if we need it, but I think we're okay at the moment. Good. So Paula and Tony are there to take the questions. The only thing I would say is because we've got old-fashioned technology. So when you've got the microphone, you need to talk literally into it straight, otherwise the online audience won't be heard. So who would like to go first? We don't need to screen share.
Thank you very much for that. That's very, very interesting. You very clearly showed the high levels of dissatisfaction generally across the world with democracy. And it seems to be that at the moment, the way that people are reacting to that is to vote in governments that are more populist and in many respects more authoritarian and kind of almost seem to be the antithesis of some of the things that they're concerned about. Do you have a view as to why people's reaction to their dissatisfaction with democracy is to vote in governments that in a lot of cases appear to be less democratic? And is there any evidence that where they've done this, and those governments have been around for a little while, perhaps somewhere like Hungary, for example, they're actually more satisfied now than they were before they voted in those kind of governments?
Okay, no, that's a very good question. And I think the answer comes in different parts. So, you know, we've had the Boris Johnson effect, right? And in this country where, he won the landslide because people felt that actually he represented them. So it was quite a populist vote, that he represented them and that he would get things done, where in fact, sort of democracy as it was exercised by bureaucrats before wouldn't get done. It would get sorted. And obviously after Boris and the various issues that his government had, and the circumstances under which he left, and then the Conservative fell on their own sword, ultimately, showed that actually people didn't feel that the Conservative Party, in this case, actually delivered for them. So the reason why people veer towards solutions like that is because they feel disenfranchised, that they actually don't have any say. So what they want is someone to give them certainty and promises that they will sort things out on their behalf. And that's why people veer sometimes to extremes. And, that is worrying. And to some extent, it is forgivable in countries that haven't had that history. I mean, my own country, having gone through the social nationalism in the 20th century, to be in the position to have a far-right populist party being the second largest contributors to the Bundestag is a frightening prospect. But it's happening in other places. There is definitely a generational distrust. I didn't show a slide because I wanted to keep this manageable. But the younger population are far more critical of democracy than the interwar population, for example. The millennials are the worst, right? The baby boomers are bad, but the interwar generation, not so much. So actually, the younger people are, the more disenfranchised they are.
Thanks, Andreas. I'd like to put a couple of positive points, first of all. Remember that in the lifetime of a lot of people sitting in this room, Greece, Portugal, and Spain were fascist dictatorships.
Yes.
So that has changed.
Yeah.
Poland brought in a populist government and have now got rid of it. And also, I suspect, as a lot of people do, that Trump will actually be a good thing for democracy because people will see the shambles and the chaos. And it's not me, a lot of experts think that, and that will just simply cut the ground from under the feet of a lot of Trump wannabes. However, I think the problem is not the problem that you are stating. The problem is, and I referred particularly to work of Walter Scheidel, who was a historian who looked at the natural state of government and concluded the natural state of government was always some sort of autocracy. And he wrote a book called The Great Levelling. And his thesis was that only great events such as major plagues, such as the Black Death, or things like world wars, actually cause levelling. Otherwise, there was always a tendency to revert to a natural state of autocracy because the autocrats and the plutocrats, as they are now, deliberately contrived that situation. And I would say that the reason there is a distrust of democracy, and may I just correct your statistics about the millennials? Yes, a lot do. I think about 20%, 80% don't think that they think rather that democracy is actually basically a good idea. Now, what I think is happening is that we are having a deliberate campaign, certainly in this country by the papers, along with other social media, to simply make us dissatisfied with democracy because populism is a front always, and historically that's the case, is always a front for plutocracy. And it's the plutocrats who are deliberately trying to undermine democracy.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I heard the question, but I know exactly what you mean. So I think we'll talk about the statistics later because I've got the slide I can show you about the millennials. But I think in terms of your point, you're absolutely right. So I think a major change in humanity only really changes when the platform is on fire. We're quite latent. We're quite creatures of comfort to some extent, of habit. And only if something extraordinary happens does the mindset really shift. So I agree with you there. And therefore, we are eminently controllable. And that's what people like Yanis Varoufakis are saying. You know, we are the comfortably numb. We actually, you know, we are being controlled, and we don't actually mind being controlled, right? Because of the state that we're in. What you're saying is that actually a disrupting force like Trump and the I wouldn't call it chaos. Okay, the disruptive change that is likely to happen is likely to wake us up, right? And either react against it or support it. And I think the way, obviously, that chapter hasn't been written yet. We already know what he was like the first time round, right? So we know some of the things about the war, immigration, tariffs, make America great again, which unfortunately in his view seems to suggest that make everybody else worse off again. So, but that chapter isn't written. And I think the point I'm making is we need to wake up from the meaning crisis and actually realize that as people, we have a role to play in this. So yes, I agree with you that there's a certain amount of latency, and you only if you shook up from that latency do things really change. There's some people in the front.
Thank you. Thanks for a really interesting, stimulating discussion and your presentation. Really enjoyed it. I think building on your last point and also a couple of things in the slides, when we come back to the individual and our value set as an individual person and what we see going on and how much we either agree or disagree with that, and where those values are formed as we grow up, as we go into education, the society we live in. Yeah. How, I guess, because this is quite a dark picture, isn't it? How, as an individual, and in terms of what we're doing in some of those places, can we hope to turn around the individual force to take over from, you know, the autocracy that we're starting to see? Yeah. And I wondered whether that should give us some confidence. I mean, on a very micro level, I've just started some work in a local primary school. And, you know, their values are all about caring for others, listening to others, supporting each other, looking at the overall good, a bit about what you were saying about what do I demand, but also what can I contribute. So a lot of things that happen are in the greater good, but then we are faced with the governments, the society that we live in. So I wonder how much we can, because your point about what do we do as an individual, what do we do collectively or individually that really will make that larger difference apart from just voting?
Yeah, well, exactly. So I think we need to create a shared environment where it's actually okay to have dissenting voices, where you can actually reason and talk things through. It's interesting though, because you know, our perception of human nature is actually quite important here. So when you work in primary schools, you know, when I've worked with kids, kids are generally benevolent to each other, right? They actually understand values. You know, kids in primary schools, you know, toddlers, they just start understanding these kind of things. They might need to be guided sometimes. But I think, you know, education is probably the most important thing. Not just in schools, but also as parents, as grandparents, etc. Actually talk about things through, because even education is constrained, right? It's a particular curriculum, and obviously, I don't know how many people are working in education in this room, but it's becoming more and more constrained. It's becoming more bureaucratized, and actually less time is actually spent discussing, or the ability to discuss topics that we discussed today. So I think education is really important. Spaces are important. So this is why I love this institution so much, because it is a place, you know, where people can come together and have discussions and talk about things, which aren't necessarily possible in other places. So I think that, you know, we need to be able to have shared spaces, places, and education where actually having different views is actually seen as something positive from which we can learn more than just basically having our own previous previously already established views corroborated once more. I think there's a gentleman there. Oh, Paul, questions online?
Yeah, I'll go for this.
No?
Yeah, I've got
Paul is on the way.
I've got one which is an observation. You clearly don't like the AfD in Germany, and they are, I agree, difficult to like. But I'm sure you'd agree that having them within the parliament is an expression of that parliament's effectiveness as a democracy. If you shut them out, they find other ways of making their point. So I think, personally, to try and squash them out, I think was your word, is perhaps an undemocratic thing to do.
No.
That's my observation. The question I wanted to ask was this. How concerned are you by this so-called deplatforming in universities? We have regular instances of certain speakers just not being allowed to be heard at university unions throughout the country. Do you think this is okay, or do you actually see that as a problem for our society or a democratic society?
No. One is I think the Alternative für Deutschland is a political party which has a following that needs to be heard, right? So you can't just shut them out. I'm concerned about deplatforming at universities significantly, because I think there are regulations and rules in place in terms of human rights, and if it incites violence and terror, etc., then obviously there's a limit to free speech. Okay, but just to deplatform somebody because they have a different opinion. J.K. Rowling, for example, being deplatformed from universities, seems to be the opposite. But I think this is, we're living in a democracy that's undemocratic in that case. We actually got people making decisions because they feel it wouldn't resonate with a certain audience and wouldn't reinforce previously held beliefs. I think that's fundamentally wrong. If there's a proper exchange of opinions, there needs to be a degree of freedom of speech, but it shouldn't be inciting hatred, it shouldn't be inciting violence, it shouldn't just, and if you have discussions, you should have it from more than one perspective necessarily. What about online, Paul? We have to go to online as well.
We've got a number, actually, a number of comments and one or two questions. So the first one that came in is perhaps a cynical quote by H.L. Mencken in 1916, which was, democracy is the pathetic belief in the collective and wisdom of the individual ignorance. So I'll leave that. And we've got social media perception as good or bad for democracy. Question, how do the figures correlate with the percentage of people across age groups actually using social media? This is one of the slides you showed. I think you showed it by country, but not by people.
Well, I think the answer to that very briefly would be is that younger people generally see social media in a more positive light than older people.
Okay. A couple of comments on something you said. Obligatory suffrage in Australia, is it actually enforced? And the Swiss government are not obliged to implement the results of their referenda.
Well, my sister-in-law is actually living in Australia and has got Australian citizenship. And they came over to the UK when they're supposed to be voting in Australia, and she has had her fine, which I think was 50 or 60 Australian dollars, served upon her. I suppose it's not exactly much of a deterrent. 50 or 60 Australian dollars is about, what, 30 quid. So I think people wouldn't probably flinch at paying that, but no, it is enforced.
Shall I do one more and then we'll have another question and then come back to me? We had I think you mentioned the referendum, the EU referendum. Someone suggested it was consultative, someone else said it was binding, David Cameron said it was binding, so we're back to that argument about whether there should have been a second referendum. We'll move on swiftly, I think, so perhaps another question.
Good. More.
Shall I? Okay. I just wonder, you talked about public understanding of and trust in democracy, etc. Have you got any sense of what the general understanding of people is of the word democracy? I mean, on the first slide you had kind of different definitions. Just to simplify, I mean, I would think that many people would just say it's the will of the majority. You know, the majority can do what they like. But then you could contrast that with everybody is able to have their say in some way. Yes. Like in some kind of participatory systems. Yes. And I just, you know, when you ask people about democracy, do they really understand this? I mean, to bring up the dreaded referendum again, you know, I was highly active in the campaign for a second referendum and all of that. And the number of people who were saying, you're undemocratic, I couldn't give a damn about Parliament, you know, the people have voted, they were supported Boris Johnson suspending Parliament. So anyway, just some comments on that, please.
No, I mean, absolutely. So I think if you asked 100 people in Bath, randomly in the street, their definition of democracy, it will vary. And I think, you know, quite a few people will probably say, nobody stops me from doing what I want to do, would be one answer. And I think, you know, in the age of the individual, that's going to be a increasing voice. I can do what I like, subject to certain constraints that are legal, etc., which is more of a libertarian type of response. But no, I mean, democracy, you know, is people and rule, you know, which we talked about. You know, it's a rule by the people, of the people, for the people, by the people. But you know, in practice, is how many people feel empowered to be participating, and that's the other slide. You know, where some North Korea. -2, Norway plus 1.77. You know, people feel that they have an active role to play. And if you feel you have an active role to play, you're more likely to actually go about and do it. Whereas if you feel that you have nothing to add, then you won't participate. And I think, you know, I deliberately talked about in the title about democracy, but really what we really should be talking about is what is an effective and good governance. And then come up with what that consists in, rather than starting off with a particular political ideology. The gentleman at the front here, Tony.
Thanks. One of the problems with democracy, as you said, whatever it might be, its main enemy can be seen as democracy. So the way in which we are governed, you have an election, general election, and the parties try to win it. Now, they don't win it, they've discovered, by uncomfortable truths. You don't win an election by saying, look, hard times ahead. We're threatened by Russia. We need to up our game in defense, and that means a lot of things you'd like we can't have. So given that that isn't the way to win an election, you play another game, even if that means losing your country. How do you actually get to that nitty-gritty of people being prepared to confront difficult choices, and how do you have a political class that's got the guts to point that out?
Yeah, no, very good question. And I think I mean, nobody gets elected on bad news, right? We've discovered this in spades, whether that's the referendum, whether it's something else. You know, if you say unemployment is doubling and inflation is going to go through the roof, but we'll fix it, and that's not going to hold sway. And I think the underlying problem is that we suffer from ideologies that seesaw from government to government. And therefore, you don't have any consistency in the application. I mean, I would think that if you asked every political party, from the far right to the far left, what kind of country should we build? You wouldn't get that many dissenting voices. You want a successful country, you want a prosperous country, you want a healthy country, you want to have people where it's a country for everybody, rather than just few. The problem is, as soon as you've got the ideologies coming in, the way to get there are fundamentally different. And once the ideology takes place, whether it's right-wing or left-wing, that is being enacted in a way that disenfranchises part of the electorate. And then the next party comes along and some of this stuff gets dismantled. And you'll find that, I mean, in America, you know, he's only been in one day, you will find that actually a lot of the previous policies are being dismantled already. The Paris Climate Change Accord, gone. Participation in the World Health Organization, gone. We're back to binary genders, male and female. The Gulf of Mexico is going to be renamed the Gulf of America. Yeah? Greenland is going to become part of the United States of America, the 52nd state or whatever it might be. Yeah, these are things where we are not taking part. We are looking at ideologies. And actually what the world really needs is focusing on the issues. So actually, you know, the biggest success could be for people to actually be asked not to be part of political parties with their own ideologies, but to come to the issue, and this is with their knowledge and their experience. And that's why the Pew Center research shows in every single country, the number one thing is better politicians. Better politicians who've been there, have done that, and made a positive contribution as a result. That's the start. People get interested in education. Where are political world issues being discussed in schools? You know, how many so the UN has got an existential issue list, right? And before Ukraine, nuclear war was relatively further down the line. It's obviously shot up currently. So nuclear war, 1. AI, 2nd. Artificial intelligence, which we didn't really talk about, the risks that poses. And 3rd, climate change. Those are the existential threats that the UN is looking at. Are they really being taught in school? We do lots of stuff around STEM, you know, and this is the question. So sorry to be a rumbling answer to your more succinct question.
So I just want to go back to the beginning of your comments about the United States and the...
Let me guess, I hear a certain twang.
And those who don't carry passports and their view of Trump, and those who carry passports and their view of Trump. I carry a US passport, and I apologize.
Now, to be honest, that was a very glib comment of mine, but this is certainly my experience. I remember visiting my son in America, and we drove through Ohio, and we met some state troopers in Ohio who told me reliably that London is in lockdown because of the infidels. So I think it would be interesting to get your view actually in terms of American politics. How polarized is it? And can Democrats still talk to Republicans? What do you think?
You know, we live in some bubbles, and so I'm not quite able to answer your question. I come from a very large family, 12 of us, 12 children. One voted for Trump, and he and I have a very difficult relationship.
Okay, thank you for that honesty.
Can I take us back to the Brexit referendum? I think that for many people who voted to leave the EU were people who otherwise often don't actually come out to vote. And I think for many people, their trust in our democratic institutions was challenged when what they experienced was seeing parties across the political spectrum trying to overturn that democratic vote. So I think what we've now seen with reform and the growth of reform is just another indication of people who felt quite disenfranchised by political parties who they don't look very different to each other. Certainly Conservative and Labour, in many respects, for a lot of people in this country, don't look very different from each other. So I'm not saying reform is the answer, but I'm saying I think we need to be much more have much more humility as people who perhaps are more consider ourselves to be more actively informed and maybe involved in politics, not to demean the views of people who come from different perspectives.
Absolutely spot on. And I think, the issue is that that's where we're at the moment. So I think, the referendum, going back to the referendum, for example, lots of people felt disenfranchised with the referendum and also with Europe. The problem is, these discussions, like a referendum, aren't a binary thing like right and wrong. There are deep-seated reasons why people are really not happy. And really what Europe should have learned is that actually their bureaucracy is not working, is not helping Europe. And that bureaucracy hasn't changed as a result of the referendum. And they should have learned that actually, the second biggest economy in the Eurozone leaving, right, is an issue. And actually it's left for various reasons. Some of them were bureaucratic reasonings, etc. So, there needs to be a reform where, and this comes back to the other point, better politicians. Not bureaucrats, not technocrats, politicians who are stateswomen and statesmen who actually have done what they want to do and actually can get buy-in. And I think you're absolutely right. We need to get to a place where we get out of our echo chambers, out of our own sort of opinion vacuums, and actually get into an environment where we can actually openly discuss these things in a meaningful way, rather than just shouting ad hominem attacks at each other. That's the way forward in terms of our participation. But we also need better politicians, and we need better business leaders. The business leaders, when I started my career, like most of you, a CEO of a company was there till retirement for years, and the direction of the company was set in terms of a vision, mission, and values that carried through 10, 20 years. The average lifespan of a CEO is 18 months now. And the new one comes in, the deck gets shuffled around, and here we go again. Nothing is achieved. So I think we need to start listening to each other. I totally agree.
We've got some more questions online, shall I?
Yeah, let's go online, then we come back to the room. We've got another 10 minutes or so.
Right, okay. Somebody's sort of pointing to one of the reasons for populism, which is the present levels of mass migration. So suggesting that the cultures are often alien or possibly hostile to liberal democracy, plus the reality that before my 10-year-old granddaughter is 30, her culture, views, values will be in a minority. So what can be done to protect her future? So I think that's really pointing to one reason why there's the growth in populism.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the granddaughter's value set and opinions are at the moment, and how she will be in the minority from the comment. But I think the thing is, opinions and values change, right? It's how they change that's important. Yeah, are they changed because you just find yourself in an echo chamber and therefore it just gets reinforced? Or do we actually have the ability to actually have reasoned discussion and evaluation of information? So one of the biggest issues around social media, for example, or media in general, isn't necessarily that in some autocracies where the media isn't free. Let's say the media in the UK, for example, is free and can do what they want. And some people think too much. Yeah, Prince Harry clearly does, and has been fighting them. But the sheer volume of information that's out there nowadays, it is impossible for anybody to actually get underneath the skin of all of the issues that people are being presented with. In the olden days, you read the newspaper once a day, maybe listen to the 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock news. Now the bombardment of information and opinions is so rife that actually it's more or less impossible to form an informed view of any particular issue in enough detail. And that's the big issue. Because it's just skim reading. It is literally just sound bites, aphorisms that you can react to. And to get to a place where you actually get out of that fog, that media fog, and actually trying to concentrate on what's important, I think that's what's going to differentiate really whether the audience member's granddaughter is going to be happy or unhappy as she grows up.
Shall I ask? I've got a few more here, so I'll ask one more and then throw it back to the room. One person is suggesting that the answer to all the problems is a benevolent dictatorship, which of course works as well as until they stop doing what you want them to do, and then you're in trouble. Someone else is saying, thanks for the talk. Is AI a great hope or a great threat to the, is it likely to lead to a wobbly concept of democracy?
AI, well, I'm glad somebody mentioned it because I was surprised. We've been going here for nearly an hour and a half, and the two-letter acronym AI hasn't come up. I think AI is, it's different. I think AI is a game changer insofar that we are already no longer in full control, would be my view. Having talked to a gentleman from the MOD a few months ago, he actually believes fundamentally that AGI, so artificial general intelligence, is already with us. And our efforts to consider moral and ethical implications of AI is lagging the technological development by about a decade. So we already are at the cusp of no longer understanding what AI does. And therefore, we're at the cusp of not being able to control AI. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Only time will tell. I mean, AI is a completely different substrate to the human. I mean, at the moment, AI is dangerous because it is programmed by human prejudices, right? So, when you go for a job, the algorithms have been set out in a certain way that certain people are less likely, with the same qualifications and same experience, will be rooted out because of the prejudices in the AI. And autonomous defense systems are already in place. Autonomous kill machines, things like that. But they're different. They don't have the same value set. So it's only now that AI is actually beginning no longer to be programmed by us, but it's actually self-learning, that we are in the place where we can't control it, and therefore we don't know what's going to happen. But it doesn't mean it's going to be trying to exterminate us. It's just probably going to find us, to some extent, irrelevant or symbiotic because we provide energy and electricity. Who knows?
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I have two questions, and I'm happy for you to pick any one to answer. In answer to the primary school teacher's question of what can an individual do in today's world, you mentioned that we have these kind of forums to discuss. Now, I'm pretty sure that world over there are forums like these, but having attended the previous talk, the previous discussion that you had 2 weeks ago around what world do we live in?
Yes.
Trump and Elon Musk are on the forefront of all our conversations. The fact that we think that the world is being driven by technocrats or oligarchs. Do you think just these forums where we just talk and discuss, is that enough? Because I don't see how we can have an impact without taking some action or having a different voice actually causing some stir, just as say Jeff Bezos or Musk have the power to turn things around?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So, I mean, education is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition to effect change. Marching itself is demonstrating your dissatisfaction with something, okay? But there must be other ways where we can participate in change that isn't just about riding against the prevailing system, but actually engages the prevailing system in discussion. So these are forms. This is participation in the democracy. This is about voting. It's about establishing opinion groups. You know, using social media, for example, on a positive basis to actually get people to participate. I mean, that was the great hope of the internet and social media. That was liberating thoughts, not to compress them into two echo chambers that fight each other tooth and nail. So yes, there's much more than just education.
Thank you. I did want to ask another question before I give away the mic. We do live in a very interdependent, interconnected world. Now, with Trump's new executive orders, where he has decided to impose tariffs on 2 countries, chances are he's likely to do that to the others. Is one of the outcomes possible where every country will retaliate, want to become self-sufficient, and we then start becoming less interdependent? Is that a likely outcome to happen? What's your opinion?
Well, I mean, there's so many different outcomes. So I think, you know, the tariffs that are going to be levied by the 1st of February, 25% I think is muted against Canada and Mexico to start off with. I mean, looking at the stock markets, I think the European countries are already quite nervous in terms of what's going to come next. But, you know, there's always the law of unintended consequences. You know, Trump may well find out that actually this is going to be something negative to the US economy rather than something positive. So I think, you know, I think the jury is out. I think the jury is out in terms of saying, look, are we going to be more isolationist, or are we going to be more coming together as a country? I think the danger is that the world currently, the global zeitgeist, is that we're becoming more nationalistic, is the prevailing zeitgeist, rather than actually getting together to tackle the big global issues that we have inherited over the last few centuries. That's the problem. We should be having discussions around how to solve the biggest problems in the world, rather than going to seesaw from one ideology to another. Yeah. I think we've got room for one more question before we have to shut it down, I'm afraid. This gentleman here. Okay.
Andreas, thank you for the presentation. But I was left wondering whether Socrates was right in terms of where the evidence was that a full democracy is the right answer. Because that wasn't there in terms of the stats you presented. It was kind of presumed, and you can obviously look to the Scandinavian countries as one example, but you could look to the UK and to the US to see economies that aren't the fastest growing in the world. They're not equitable. Healthcare is letting the most vulnerable down. We can talk about present-day cultural contributions to the world. And it left me thinking whether we are asking the right question, and if the attacks on democracy are around the participation of people, or the level of participation, and whether the quality of participation is right, would it be a useful, fun thought experiment to think about a constitution for a benevolent dictator that takes us in a different direction?
Well, very good question to finish off with. And I think the two terms, benevolent and dictator, always turn out to be an oxymoron. And every dictator starts off with the best possible intentions. But then, as power increases, as riches increases, corruption increases, etc., so we end up in an environment where a benevolent dictator is actually doing the opposite. And actually, you know, we've seen this. I mean, you know, to some extent, Saddam Hussein did a lot in Iraq in terms of literacy, in terms of supporting the poor, in terms of doing this, in terms of doing that. He did lots of benevolent things, but he ended up being someone who could no longer control his own ego and thought he was the pseudo-messiah for the Arab world. And there's some good stuff in there. You know, uniting the Arab world rather than being all disparate to us as a shared voice is a good thing. But the way he then externalized that is wrong. So there's no such thing as a permanent, benevolent dictator. And I think the issue is this country is always, in fact, I'm going to say something that I'll probably regret, right? But with the current electoral system in the UK of first past the post, most of us, for most of the time, live in a democratic dictatorship of 4 years. Anyway, on that positive note of reflection, thank you very much for being such an interactive audience, and I hope you got something out of it. I apologize for the detail of the slides. Please look up the slides on the YouTube channel in a few weeks' time, because that will give you the information and also the reference points so you can dig deeper. So thank you very much. And just before you go, just to let you know about next month. So next month, as you know, it will be the 3rd anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. And we've been running a series since the invasion with 2 professors from America beaming here into the Elwyn room, Paul Danieri and Rajan Menon, and they will talk about the possible solutions to the war in Ukraine. Obviously, lots of things have happened. So I suggest, I think it's on the 18th of February, I suggest you come along to that, because so much has changed in the Ukraine in the last 12 months, which largely we haven't heard about at all. The Ukraine has gone so quiet, and it's gone quiet for lots of different reasons. So please join us here at the BLSI on the 18th of February, which is all about the war in the Ukraine. What is the solution? Thank you very much, and have a safe journey home.